My name is Shane Collum, and for the past 2 months I've been working on a 2D game for my game design and development course. In this video, I want to go through the whole process that eventually led to my completed demo to my game. Before I even thought about developing anything, I needed to come up with an idea and make a plan. For coming up with an idea, I mostly viewed this project as a way to flex and expand my current skills, so I decided to stick with things I was familiar with. This means many ideas I show off will be recontextualized mechanics from an array of other games I enjoy. To start by picking a genre, I knew I would be making a platformer, so I decided to branch that out into a small-scale Metroidvania. The big thing is that I would focus my Metroidvania to be platforming exclusive, no combat. While it might seem a bit contradictory with how half the genre is derived from Castlevania's iconic combat, I feel it's a rather unexplored area of the genre, especially since many games use exploration as a sole substitute for platforming when the two could easily work together. I decided to use the progression abilities of the wall jump, double jump, and dash, as these are typical upgrades for players to come across in these games, while still being really easy to design levels and mechanics around. I then had to come up with a plan. I didn't know much about what to prioritize for the general flow of game development yet, but I knew the biggest but easiest issue for me to avoid was going to be scope creep. With this in mind, I came up with a 5-step plan to keep me on track. Player controls, level elements, art and animations, level design, and general polish and aesthetics. I decided to aim to spend about 1.5 weeks on each part so that I would have a consistent deadline to work towards and give myself a good bit of time at the end for anything else I may have forgotten. With all that in place, it was time to start developing the game. I had 4 tasks for making the player controls: movement, wall jump, double jump, and a dash. To start with the movement, all I needed was a jump and horizontal controls. I first set some basic parameters for the player with code and start function, setting their rigid body to dynamic, making gravity set to 3, and freezing their rotation. I used getRawAxis to get movement for the player, and then when the player pressed the jump button, which was set to space, a variable called jump force would be added to the y-axis of the player's linear velocity. Easy work. To make sure the player couldn't jump infinitely, I needed to make sure they couldn't jump in midair. To do this, I added an empty object to the player in Unity, then through code I made this object have a small radius, where if it detected the ground layer in this radius, the player would be grounded. If the player was grounded, the boolean can jump would be set to true until the player was midair, stopping them from jumping infinitely. Adding the double jump to this was easy, as I simply had to add a new boolean called can double jump, and made it so if the player pressed the jump button, and can jump was false, it would let the player jump again, and then set can double jump to false, only resetting when on the ground. This let the player jump once in midair. For the dash, I decided to take inspiration from Mega Man Zero, where they had a ground-only dash that gave a speed boost, where the duration would only end on the ground and could be extended by jumping, along with being snappy and stopping completely when the player turned around or stopped moving. To make sure the player couldn't dash infinitely, I first added a boolean can dash. I then needed to use a coroutine to be able to make the code wait before ending the dash for a set duration, which was easily done. For the speed boost, I simply stored the original move speed in a separate variable, then multiplied the move speed by a variable dash power, then set it back after the duration was over and only if the player was grounded, allowing the player to extend the duration by jumping like I intended. For the conditions to stop dashing, I wasn't able to stop the dash when the player stopped moving, specifically midair, but I did get the player to stop dashing when turning around. First, I needed to make a function to flip the player sprite, which I simply got using the local scale of the sprite and then multiplying the x value by -1 to flip it. I used the boolean is facing right to determine which way the player was facing and used their current move speed along with the x-axis to tell if they need to be flipped or not. Then, in the dash function, I had a variable to save which way the player was not currently facing, and if it ever did become the direction the player was facing, the dash would end instantly. I also added a simple trail while the player was dashing to better indicate when the dash was active for the player. Finally was the wall jump. I first added a wall check, which in similar fashion to the ground check was an empty object attached to the player that would check in a small radius for the wall layer, which would then allow the player to wall jump. First, it would make the player wall slide, which made the player fall at a slower speed, though this didn't end up working, which ultimately served as a piece of redundant code. Then for the wall jump, if the player was wall sliding, and the wall jump direction would be set to the opposite way the player was facing. Once the player pressed the jump button, it would send them away from the wall with an equal vertical and horizontal force, along with a counter called wall jump counter, not allowing the player to wall jump for a short time after. This created a short and snappy wall jump, which players could use to scale walls, similar to Hollow Knight. I also made the wall jumping refresh the double jump. Along with this, for the sake of game feel, I decided to add Coyote Time, which is simply a grace period that allows the player to still jump shortly after they walk off a ledge. This was easily done by making an extremely small value that would constantly decrease with delta time, but reset to its original value when the player was grounded. I then added a condition to the player jump where if Coyote Time was above 0, they could still jump, which means this value would only decrease when the player is mid-air, and then give them a short window after walking off a ledge to still be able to jump. Next was creating the level elements, which the main goal was flexibility. I started with having the player simply be able to be killed, which was an easy task. I set a transform called respawn point, which is initially set the player's starting position in the scene, and if the player enters a trigger zone of an object tagged kill player, the player's position is then set to the respawn position. This made it so I could make a tile set with the tag and be able to kill the player using that tile set whenever I wanted, as well as making future obstacles easy to set up with the tag. Having a respawn point variable also made it easy to make a checkpoint system for the game, where when the player entered the trigger zone of an object labeled checkpoint, the respawn variable would be set to the transform position of that checkpoint. Next, I made a saw obstacle, which was simply a circle collider with the kill player tag. I also made a crusher, which is an animated object that had various hitboxes move with the animation. I also made it so the player could wall jump off the sides and stand on top of it. I wanted to be able to offset these obstacles and change their speed, so I made a new script where I simply got the object's animator through serialized field and then changed the speed and the animation and how long of a delay it would have before it started, which I could then attach to any animated object I wanted for the future. I only need to make an empty animation state and transition with a trigger to have the code work properly, which wasn't too hard. I then moved on to making a moving platform. To do this, I had a list made where transforms could be put in it to determine the various points the platform would move to. Then in the code, I had the platform go to each point in the list with the move towards function. I then added that the player would become a child of the platform so that they would move with it instead of having the platform slide from under them. I attempted to have the platform stop for a certain amount of time when it reached a point, but I wasn't able to get it working, so I ultimately ditched the idea. I then didn't like how the platform moved, so I decided to instead repurpose it to a moving saw. I also made a new script which could be attached to any object, which would make the player a child of that object while on it, which proved to be useful for the crusher I made earlier. I still wanted a moving platform, so I made a new object that was animated instead. While I couldn't change the points the object would move between, I could change the speed and the delay since I was using an animation. I also added some code to reset the player's rotation when exiting collision with the object due to how it moved, which would permanently offset the player's rotation. I also added some one-way platforms to the game. It was easy to do using Unity's built-in platform effector tool. I also added some code to the player controller where if they were to press down while standing on an object tagged one-way platform, they would have their collision disabled with that object for a short amount of time. I was able to add this tag to my moving platforms to add some more functionality to them. I then made one final obstacle of a giant saw arm which would swing down at the player, also done through animation. Finally, I made the collectibles for my game. 2 types. One for general collection, and one for unlocking the abilities. This was another case of trigger enter and a mix of tags. For the ability unlocks, if the object was tagged with the respective ability, then it would change a boolean from false to true, which that boolean would then allow the player to use said ability. The collectibles would simply increase a counter when collected. All these values would be stored in a game manager for easy tracking of the most important variables, and all the collectibles would be destroyed on collision. Now came all the art and animations for my game. The general theme of the game was going to be more robotic, with the setting being in a scrapyard/factory. This was mostly to play into my strength of skeletal animation mixed with pixel art, as the animations would look more natural with how stiff robots often move. The player was designed first, where there are a few aspects I wanted to show in the character design. First was the wheel, which I added so I wouldn't have to animate legs. Then was the generally rusted look, which actually became enhanced in-game due to the compression the sprite faced. Finally was this gear in the middle, which was similar to the collectibles and gears I made on other robots. I wanted this gear to move based on what the player was doing, such as spinning rapidly when running. I made a running, idle, jump, and fall animation, which I ended up being quite happy with. I added some simple parameters for these animations to trigger in the player controller code. One issue I ran into was my wall jump not working anymore, at least not properly. While I struggled initially, I came to realize weeks later it was most likely due to how I had the player hitbox attached to the animated components, which most likely offset things like the wall check. And while this was an easy fix, this was only discovered once I had finished most level design, so the wall jump was scrapped by the end. Although, I don't think this is a bad thing, as I realized the scope creep with 3 unlockable abilities would have bloated the level design a good bit. I then did some work on art and animation for all the level objects I made earlier. I decided to pull from one of the pre-made tile palettes in the Libra Sprite to better have a sense of consistency with the color scheme, which I think worked out quite well in the end. This also applied to the variety of tile sets I made. I made 5 tile sets for the game, one to act as the ground and the rest as various decorations depending on whereabout in the level the player was. I used rule tiles to help with all the tiles I would need to place later on down the line, which were all easy setup. Finally, we arrive at the level design, which took the largest amount of time in this project. At this point in development, I had actually ended up very far ahead of schedule, which allowed me to really expand the level design to be more appropriate for a Metroidvania. I decided to go with the Mario design philosophy, where mechanics would get introduced, expanded, and then put out as a final test to the player. This was easy enough to accomplish on a small scale, as I would know which areas the player could or couldn't get into based on the abilities they had, and the main route present in the game, allowing a steady flow of new elements while also expanding current ones. The game would be split into 3 segments, each based on the current abilities of the player: pre-dash, post-dash, and double jump. I decided to make at least 2 possible paths to each key location within the game, which would also serve to help the player avoid getting lost while also emphasizing exploration aspect present within the genre. I also decided to repurpose my pipes from decorations to guides, for the players who were a bit more observant, as it would give them an easier time navigating the map. The main goal would be for the player to obtain all the movement upgrades and to collect at least 7 of the 13 collectible gears. The theme of the level, as mentioned earlier, is that of a factory and scrapyard. I designed the middle area to be the factory and the 2 outer sides to be the outside, where more scrap can be seen and a red to purple gradient is seen in the background. I also include some secret walls to lead to alternate routes and secrets for the player to find. To move the player between the various levels, I needed to make a transition. I made an object that gets triggered, where on trigger, it sends the player to a set spawn location where the next room would be located. This would also change the camera boundaries, which I used Cinemachine for. There's not much more to say about the level design, as after I drew a mock-up map to plan out how the map would look, it just took a long time. Overall, there were 23 rooms made for the game, boasting plenty of optional content and emphasizing replayability through getting all the collectibles, or a faster time for game completion, or maybe a mix of both. Now to the polish and aesthetics to wrap up the game. The first thing I wanted to add was sound effects. It would mostly be free sounds you could find online, but it would be enough to add some life to the game. I made a sound manager that would instantiate sound effects when called, where the values for the sound effects could be altered easily. I also added code to the manager so that when the player was further away from the source of the noise, it would get quieter, which would add a bit more immersion to the game. The sound effects were easily added to the player, and I made a new script for playing sound effects on objects that didn't have the appropriate code, such as the crusher or the saw arm. I also made it easy to edit the volume and clip length of these sound effects, and to play the sound effects I used animation events since most of my objects were animated to begin with. I then went on to make an ending cutscene for my game, where if the player collects enough gears and makes it to the end, a simple UI will pop up when the player enters the specific interaction zone, along with feedback if they don't have enough gears. And then, if they do, the animation transitions to a result screen once it's finished, which gives the player the total number of gears collected and their total time, along with the option to return to the main menu. The main menu is simply a picture of a scrapyard but put through a pixel filter that also bobs up and down to give the screen a bit less of a static look. The play button sends you directly to the game, while the options button sends you to an essentially empty screen since I didn't have the time or knowledge on how to do settings. All the buttons are quite simple, either activating or deactivating game objects or calling a script to change the scene. As for the main game UI, it consists of a simple counter and timer, where the counter just pulls its value straight from the game manager for display, while the timer adds to a value using delta time, then gets the minutes and seconds through some maths operations, eventually to display a timer to the player. I also made sure to add some billboards to act as a tutorial for the player, trying to make them look a bit more natural in the world as well. I also worked on some simple music for the game. The last bit of polish came from ensuring everything was on the right layer and ensuring sound effects were properly mixed for the player while running through the game. And with all that done, the game was as finished as it could be before the deadline approached. I'm extremely happy with how it turned out, but there are some things I could have handled differently. I believe the strongest aspect of my project was the planning I approached with this, as I gave myself ample time to get everything done and even allowed myself to create some really expansive levels. I do wish I spent more time on code, as all of it felt really simple and could have been expanded upon for some more unique interactivity. I also feel the game was very safe by the end, as I realistically could have pushed myself for a more expansive concept to build the game around, rather than it simply being a Metroidvania focused on platforming. I also feel the game could have been improved upon, the game feel specifically, both mechanically and aesthetically. Simple effects like a dust cloud while running or death animations would have went a long way, and the mechanic of the player's double jump could have been a lot more weighty, similar to Hollow Knight with a small delay before its double jump, and it would have went a long way to improve how the character felt to control. Other than those changes, I'm quite happy with the state of everything else in the game. I had essentially worked non-stop at this project during the 2 months we had, and the effort clearly shows. At the end of the day, I had a lot of fun making this project, and even plan to keep developing it out in my spare time. So, until then, thanks for watching and have a good day.